Today, joining the Human Progress podcast is Matt Warner. He is president of Atlas Network, a nonprofit that aims to secure the right to economic and personal freedom for all individuals through its global network of think tanks supporting local NGOs in more than 90 countries. Matt is an expert on economic development, institution building, nonprofit management, and impact philanthropy. And his writing has appeared in Foreign Policy, The Hill, Forbes, Harvard's Education Next, and the Cato Journal, among others. And he joins me today to discuss his latest book, co-authored with Cato Senior Fellow Tom Palmer, Development with Dignity, Self-Determination, Localization, and the End to Poverty. This book argues that an end to poverty can only be achieved by prioritizing human dignity. Fostering discussions on how we might achieve higher living standards and lower rates of poverty, of course, is one of the things that humanprogress.org and this podcast is all about. So I've been looking forward to this conversation. Thank you so much for joining me, Matt. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing very well and appreciate this opportunity. I think the work that you guys do at Human Progress is excellent.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of Atlas Network. So let's start with the big picture. What is the book about and why did you write it?
Well, Atlas Network, of course, has been involved for 40 years in supporting local organizations, mostly think tanks who are working on strengthening the free society. And right now, what's happening in the global economic development community is this big push to rethink how they go about achieving strengthened institutions of liberal democracy, because we've had very disappointing results the last 3 decades in particular. And this whole idea of localization is their answer to say, we need to be deferring more and supporting local leadership, local vision for change, and putting in the back seat kind of foreign interventionist models. And so we saw an opportunity, Tom and I, to help further that conversation as sort of, we are encouraged by this turn to localization, but it's important to really go deep into understanding why localization is important. What is it about local voices that's critical to getting the institutions right? And we have lots of great examples that we've benefited from many years of watching and learning from think tanks around the world who have been doing just that, and gaining an appreciation for the nuances of what looks like partnering with locals and what's actually supporting local vision for change.
Right. So this book obviously really connects with Atlas Network's work. But before we delve deeper into the book, could you talk a little bit about Atlas Network for those viewing or listening to this podcast who might not be familiar with the organization?
Sure. We're a nonprofit, as you said. We ourselves don't do work on the ground, but we're very much close to the work on the ground because we support both with grants and with providing networking opportunities for think tank leaders around the world who are committed to the free society. Our founder, Sir Anthony Fisher, founded the Institute of Economic Affairs in England in the 50s, which later became credited with many of the sort of intellectual and cultural foundations with which the liberal move in the Thatcher era could happen. And so this idea of think tanks is really starting to get its due, both because the number and the quality of think tanks around the world has just exploded in the last 20 years, and also appreciating that there's something important about an independent voice outside of government, outside of corporate lobbying power, who can articulate and do the deep dive into researching the ideas that are going to help a society prosper. So our work is both in grant making, but also in providing this somewhat niche type of work, a network of peers from which we can accelerate learning and motivate sort of new levels of excellence and shooting for big wins.
It's very important. So this book centers dignity. How should we understand dignity, and why is it important to international development?
Well, one thing to start with is to recognize how commonplace and appreciated the idea of dignity is, at least in using the term in international development. If you go back to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the 40s, we see this term used. If you say the word at a cocktail party, people are agreeable. But to understand what do we mean by dignity, we actually need to take some pause and think about, for example, the work of Deirdre McCloskey or Joel McKeer to say the way that we think about dignity has actually changed over the centuries, going from something that signifies class or rank to a more universal, equal moral worth idea about people. And another key aspect of the modern idea of dignity that is so important is that we've also, in places where this has taken root, started to appreciate that there's something unique about an individual's knowledge about themselves and the life that they want to lead that needs to be treated with deference and reverence and respect in our institutions. And so what McCloskey and others will point to as one of the precursors of the great enrichment, the explosion in standard of living that's happened over the last 200-300 years, is that we had a shift in the way that we thought about the role of the individual in making decisions for their own lives. And the practical, efficient result of that is that you start to have people and institutions participating in supporting an uncoordinated experimentation of innovations and ideas. And this uncoordinated freewheeling experimentation is how standards of living can increase as fast as possible, because you're learning quickly and you're pivoting to what works. And what works is idiosyncratic to the particular place that a person or a community is living, both as a function of the geography, the climate, et cetera, but also the individual's preferences, which include culture and beliefs and religion, et cetera. And so to try to centralize all of that important data in the economic activity that's happening is kind of a fool's errand. What we want to do is create institutions that allow for those individual expressions of human dignity, what people prefer, what they want, what they are aspiring to, what they value. An environment that enables that, a free environment, is how you, in a very practical sense, start to achieve economic growth and development.
And to show why dignity is so important, you open the book with an extremely striking and tragic anecdote of a man driven to set himself on fire after being stripped of his dignity. And you give a number of different real-world examples throughout the book to really flesh out what you're talking about, such as the situation of the Dalit people. So to make this less abstract, could you walk through some of the concrete examples in the book that highlight the importance of dignity?
So when you're watching the world of development and you're looking at projects and what people are trying to do, there's extreme diversity, just different types of ideas about what's going to work. But I have to say that one of the most common threads in different cultures all around the world is that people who are excluded from the formal economy, informal workers, there is such a striking similarity in their articulation of why this is so oppressive to them. And it comes back to the sense of dignity that they feel denied. So you referenced what some of your listeners may recall has been cited as kind of the kickoff to the Arab Spring, which is a young man in Tunisia, Mohamed Bouazizi, who, since he had been a teenager, had provided for his family by buying some goods or produce wholesale and then selling them as a street vendor. And street vendors, again, around the world, it's such a typical way that people who are excluded, find a way to get by. You know, we think about the informal market as sort of a place of failure, but my goodness, what we're actually seeing is people up against impossible odds and getting they're surviving, and they're being very entrepreneurial about it. So so this had been Bouazizi's life. He, like many, had experienced harassment from police many times. Because you're not legal, then you're also not protected. So the police know that they can, you know, take your cash, take your goods, kick you out of where you're trying to operate. And Bouazizi had made for him a substantial investment the day before, and then went to sell it. And his goods were taken from him, and his scales, which were expensive, that he used to weigh and make sure that he's able to make a profit, those were taken from him. He spent the day trying to get his scales back and get his goods back, finding some recourse in the system, which he was denied. And as you say, his final desperate act to express the sense of indignity that he felt was unfortunately to demonstrate in front of a government office by lighting himself on fire. And the story is told that his final words were, "How do you expect me to make a living?" And this is something that I think is an important lesson all around the world. Not looking at informal markets as this obstacle to economic development, but actually the seeds of the entrepreneurial activity that every economy needs to treat with dignity, treat with respect, and look at how government and institutions can better protect and serve the expression of that entrepreneurial spirit.
Matt, you were the ones who originally actually coined the term outsider's dilemma. And this book deals with some of those unintended consequences of outsider-led development interventions, as opposed to a focus on local entrepreneurs and so forth. Could you describe the outsider's dilemma for those who aren't familiar with it, and what the book has to say on the topic?
Sure. Well, I spent a lot of time kind of doing a tour of people who work in economic development over several years, USAID, State Department, private philanthropy. And one of the things that you're struck by, at least in my experience, is these are well-intentioned people who feel sort of called to do this kind of work. And for the most part, they are doing it because they want to see communities thrive. And one of the challenges is that it becomes a bit opaque as they are disappointed by results or confronted with unintended consequences, exactly why their best intentions of what they think other people need don't end up working out. And there's this gentleman reported by the journalist Nina Monk in her book, which is a great way to wrap your head around all the failure that we've seen, unfortunately, in development. It's called it's about Jeffrey Sachs. I'm actually blanking on the name, but it's the idea that this gentleman says, "I don't understand why they don't want what we know they need," referring to a developing community that they've been trying to serve with their solutions from the outside. And what you often run into is some, well-credentialed PhD from Columbia University or wherever knows a bit about agrarianism and the latest techniques of agriculture, and looks at a developing community and says, "Oh, you know what you guys ought to do? You ought to switch from growing this crop to this crop." And the local people may become agreeable, especially when you're providing hundreds of thousands of dollars to support that change. But as we started this conversation talking about, there's something important about local knowledge, about opportunity and trade-offs. And so, for example, in Uganda, they did just that. They spent $300,000 to support a switch from growing something like a banana to corn. And they were right in the simple fact that they did have a higher crop yield, but what they didn't anticipate is that there was nowhere to sell the excess corn. The roads to markets were not passable by trucks, or it would be too expensive to do so, and there was nowhere to store it. And so you end up with an actually very worse off community, because now they have all this excess corn. And what one widow said was, yeah, we have a lot of corn, but we now have a lot of rats because it attracted an infestation. And so that's just one of so many, unfortunately, so many examples of unintended consequences when outsiders, who for the most part, like I said, at least in my reading, are very well intentioned and they want to succeed, but they are substituting the knowledge of time and place at the individual level with their own thoughts about what other people need. And that's what has to change. Oh, the book is The Idealist, and it's about Jeffrey Sachs.
Good to know. Could you describe the relationship between dignity and innovation that the second chapter covers?
Yes. So one of the things that I mentioned was the relationship between experimentation and innovation. I learned a lot from Matt Ridley's recent book on he calls it How Innovation Works. And it's very much a tour of so many different examples of stories of not one lone genius in a workshop creating some new invention that solves everyone's problems. It's much more iterative than that, and much more of a sort of decentralized collection of different people doing different things, and that the process of that leads to innovation. And innovation is distinct from invention in the sense that someone can invent something, but whether it's actually in the form that ends up being marketable and useful as a function of what consumers decide and voluntarily, part with money to improve their own lives with, that's a function of social change. That's not what one person achieves. And so recognizing this very decentralized set of exercises that lead to innovation, we have to go back and look at what are the institutions that make that most likely. I really like the way that Bob Layton and Carl Schramm put it when they talk about the kinds of economies we want that succeed are ones where there's a process of constant and continued entrepreneurial revolution. That really gets at the heart of what we're after. And you start to recognize that institutions have to be built around the idea of human dignity, because it is recognizing that any individual is equally empowered with knowledge about themselves and their preferences and their values, and that knowledge that they have, which may be tacit, it may not be something they can even express, so it certainly can't be centralized and collected. That knowledge has to be brought to bear on that process of experimentation. And again, to centralize that is folly, because you can't. It's what it's what experts call complex adaptive systems, which is kind of a mouthful, but I've really benefited from paying attention to some of this work, because it's very different from a linear solution that an expert might come up with. We need to spend this amount of money in this community to achieve this end. That's not the way human activity works. It's very much a complex adaptive system where great results happen because of a process. So we have to get the process right, not engineer outcomes. And to do that, we have to enable, protect, and respect the prerogatives of individuals, afford them the dignity of their freedom to express those values, because those values are part of the economic formula for success.
Absolutely. How does trade fit into this picture?
Well, one of the unique things about the idea of trade, if you look at polling related to economists, it's one of the few things that there is near universal agreement on, that trade benefits both parties much more than being isolated would. And that has very much to do with some of the natural consequences of expanding the universe of inputs and factors for coming up with these very sophisticated and complex sets of transactions that in retrospect you could sort of try to tell the story of. But I think one of the things that we're running into today is as the future of economic development remains a subject of great debate, trade can sometimes come under fire as some of the old ideas in development, which had been discarded and sometimes come back again, such as import substitution, become attractive to local constituencies and governments. And some of that confusion is happening because of what in the broader economic development space we look at as perhaps paradoxes of development. So many of the Asian countries that succeeded had a mix of what looks like state-led development and sometimes protectionism. But there's a great book by Michael Schumann called The Miracle, where he details what happened in Singapore and what happened in South Korea and what happened in Taiwan and in China. And it is a mixed story, but in all cases, again, it comes back to where we see success. There are incredible stories of entrepreneurship. What Deng Xiaoping talked about, we'll cross the river by feeling the stones beneath our feet, meaning don't come up with some 5-year plan anymore. Maybe politically we have to act like we're doing that kind of thing, but what really ends up succeeding are getting the processes right to let experimentation happen. And I think what we've got to do is continue to tell the stories of these complex adaptive systems of lots of individuals pursuing their best sense of what's going to work, and then the combination of all of those interactions is how you find win-win solutions.
And in the third chapter of the book, you really discuss that relationship between dignity and enterprise, and you get deep into the economic history of the world. So what was the world of our ancestors like? Why do we tend to view it through rose-colored glasses? And what was the secret of economic development that allowed the now rich countries to get to where they are?
So yeah, and in fact, Tom here contributes a great perspective talking about his grandparents' standard of living and how much has changed in such a short period of time, especially when you look at the great expanse of history. And I fear that some of our contemporaries today, particularly here in the US, sometimes lose a sense of perspective about how unique this time that we're living in is in terms of solving some of these basic issues that aren't just about material wealth. They're about infant mortality and living longer and living healthier, having more of a healthy life today. And so why did this happen? And we'd better pay attention to why it happened and make sure that we aren't being dismissive of some of those things. In the culture of growth, Joel Mokyr makes this very sort of, he boils it down to one of the key things that happened. It's not the only thing, but it's a key thing that happened 200-300 years ago, was people started thinking about ideas as things that needed to be debated and they had to stand up to scrutiny, and then combining that with doers. So you had thinkers and you had doers, what he calls savants and fabricants. So I don't know how to say it in French, but that's it's the doers and the thinkers, and then combining that to say good ideas have a relationship with effective enterprise and caring and giving dignity to people who are entrepreneurial about applying good ideas to enterprise to achieve efficiency and expand markets. And so the relationship between dignity and enterprise is very much one that has to do with the way people think about themselves and about each other. McCloskey also talks a lot about the shifts that happened in thinking about who in society is worthy of our respect. And for hundreds of years, it wasn't the merchants, it wasn't the entrepreneurs, it was the civil servants, it was the the entitled, the privileged, who had government support and backing, who owned land. I mean, it was talked, people got respect not by working, and it was sort of looked down on to have to work, but by owning land, participating in usury and these sort of things. But then you eventually have a shift that those who are tinkering, those who are doing, are combining with those who are becoming skeptics around science and caring about what actually proves to be true and not just sort of a traditional sense of what is. And that combination with increases in freedom to tinker and experiment, you started to get a feedback loop of what was working, and then that can have a snowball effect in a good way, as long as those who want to interfere with that aren't powerful enough to do so.
And of course, even today, we're still seeing incredible trends in improvement in so many different areas. In many cases, with a slight caveat that the pandemic has interrupted things, but hopefully those trends will get back on track. Why do you think growing prosperity and the data showing it is so often dismissed?
I've been reading some different ideas about explaining why. I find it mysterious. I mean, there seems to be some sort of assumed intelligence afforded to complainers, or some doomsdayers. And it's unfortunate because, again, I think we're getting back to this general theme of caring about what the culture of ideas is like, because I think it's consequential. And so if we start to see our society afford the greatest accolades to those who are pessimistic and motivated by controlling others in some sort of a punishment for some unnamed sins that we've all committed. We don't deserve to figure our way out of some of these problems. We have to pay a price. I do think that is dangerous, because it cuts against what we know has led to innovation. And we've also seen that many of the predictions of the past, because they take as static all of the conditions and then tweak a few variables over time and say, look, this is unsustainable, they don't anticipate some as yet unknown innovation that changes the game completely. I mean, we've seen this, of course, in the acre per output needed to feed a community. There's incredible advances that come along when you have the right processes allowed to proceed in place, as opposed to trying to have a central authority make some sort of an expert linear solution to solve a problem based on a limited sense of what is possible. We need as many human minds free as possible to be somewhere out there figuring out what is going to help get us to a better place, regardless of what the presenting problem is. Even when some of these, I fully acknowledge and understand, are complicated. But I think we have to pay attention to the processes that have worked when we have faced what can seem like existential crises, and not fall for the mistake of, it'd be nice to imagine that there's one genius who, if we just all listen to this one genius, that they'll fix it and save us from the things that we fear. But I'm persuaded to put much more faith in a decentralized system that lets a lot of experiments happen at once. When you go all in on one experiment, not only are you not hedging your bets that you could fail, but you're also losing the opportunity to compare your results to other things. And so you lose perspective of what might have been. And so I hope as a culture that we can re-find our footing on appreciating the power of these freewheeling processes of, you know, let's have a lot of experiments going at once because the problems are real, and the solutions are most likely to come through ways that we don't anticipate today.
Right, as many minds as possible. And that is a great segue to democracy. You deal with this in the fourth chapter, but which comes first, development or democracy? And how does dignity bolster liberal democracy?
Well, and so for some who don't follow global development and aid debates, there are many smart people who have become convinced that democracy is a luxury that very poor communities can't afford yet. And the idea is that you do need some very centrally empowered control so that you can get a hold of the mess that is happening today, do the things that these outside experts would say you've got to do, and then eventually, you know, maybe we can have some democracy. But I think that's a huge mistake. Not only is there updated evidence in our book about the very risky bet that going toward autocracy represents, that if you want your best chance at a stable growth in GDP per capita, democracy is the better way. But also that there is something important about the empowerment of individual knowledge, again, that is useful not just for economic success, but for discovering in the context of a particular time and place what the right next iteration of institutional change needs to look like. And so I think here it's important to think about pluralism as not just you know, the merits of pluralism are not just that it seems like a nice thing to say, well, I think everybody's voice should count, but to recognize that there's real value to a solution that emerges as a function of lots of data in the system. I think even someone who feels very deeply convicted about the benefits of free markets, such as myself, if you made me king for a day, I think it would be disastrous. And that's not just because my character is mixed, but because no single person can actually build institutions correctly. As the institutional scholar Richard Scott explains, institutions, the rules of the game are a function of the people that they govern. And so it's kind of a two-way street. The people are both the cause and the effect of the institutional manifestation that you get. And so while those of us who strongly believe that liberal democracy is the best governance structure that man has thought of so far, it is not the case that there is one set of institutions that you can make a blueprint of and then copycat around the world. That's not what an institution is, one that endures and functions well anyway. And that those of us who've been fortunate to live in societies that are prosperous, whose institutions are fairly functional, we have to remember that those are versions of an ideal of a particular time and place, and not the ideal themselves. And so when others, you know, when our friends around the world are working to strengthen their institutions, there's much to be gained by learning from each other and sharing ideas. Localization should not be mistaken for the idea that there's no knowledge to be shared, but who gets to decide what is going to be pursued? To me, I think it must be the people who are going to be governed by that institutional change, and not someone who gets to fly home and dust off a failure. And so I think that's very important. And so recognizing that that voices of individuals are important for economic development and for democratic strengthening, not just because it's morally right to be inclusive, but because there really is value. And it doesn't matter how formally educated they are, because you need the knowledge of their perspective about their community and what they value. I mean, we have examples in development where, you know, the frustrated aid worker is saying to the community, you guys are starving, you need to cut down this hay and harvest it. And they say, our God will not let us cut down this hay. And the local aid worker is actually not completely different from this community in terms of ethnicity and religion, but different enough that he's still seen as an outsider. And they say, only God and us know what we need to do here. And so whether they discover on their own how to reinterpret their beliefs to accommodate you using the hay, or whether they come up with a different solution that allows them to maintain that, that's their business, right? And it's important that it's their business, again, not just for moral reasons, but because you can't fix a society and set the people aside as having nothing to do with whether that society is going to work. It's going to be up to them. So they'd better be part of the solution. And I know it's messy and it's not easy, but it really is the best bet.
And yet there are some people who claim that authoritarianism or autocracy actually can promote economic development, as you just said. And you tackle that in the 5th chapter, but how do you respond to those claims? Why does autocracy, you say, lead to indignity?
Yeah, so there's two things that people who make this claim, I think, don't appreciate. One is, if you go and look at some of the examples of autocracy that have succeeded in having positive growth rates, what actually happened is not the story we're getting. So, for example, in China, it was very much a series of changes that happened organically because of what people were doing that were then codified and co-opted by the government. So in many ways, China was successful in spite of its government, not because of it. However, there was that sort of cultural shift, and rhetoric does matter, again, because the culture of ideas matter. And so there was the cultural shift that said it's good to get rich, which was a huge change in China. And so you have dignity afforded to those who are doing and being enterprising. And then the other thing that I think that they underappreciate is Bill Easterly made this point and did research on it, that he said the right way to look at whether autocracies are a good way to go is not to look at how many autocracies are doing well. It's to look at all of the autocracies together and say, what percentage of them are doing well? Because what you're really proposing is, if somebody embraces autocracy, they're taking that bet. What are the odds that they're going to succeed? And if you take all of the autocracies and look at how many are successful, it's much, much lower, obviously. It becomes a stark thing. And then you also lose other things that are very important. You know, it isn't just money. You know, Bouazizi in Tunisia cared about dignity as well as material well-being. And we see this when they survey refugees around the world, and they say, what is it that you think would be better for this community to be doing for you? And he said, we want to work. That's who we are. I'm speaking now of a member of the Rohingya tribe. And he said, we believe in taking care of ourselves. Let us work. You know, we want dignity. And so I think we need to pay attention to that. So anyway, the bottom line is that autocracy is a big risk. And it's a big risk if we're just looking at the one dimension of whether you're going to get good growth rates. It's a big risk. And it definitely comes with some bigger risks related to political liberty and civil rights and all of these other things. And as Amartya Sen points out, you need to remove unfreedoms on all of these dimensions in order for development to happen. Like, the definition of development is not just a positive growth rate. It's also freedom as an end in itself.
People often think of foreign development aid as a nice thing to do, a way of helping people, but you have a chapter titled The Indignity of Development Aid, where you discuss how foreign aid can feed corruption and can disrespect the dignity of the very people that the aid is meant to help. How does that happen?
So the common way that aid is deployed is something that is pretty much unavoidable, meaning I think it's tempting to go look at all these horrible people bringing aid into a country. And there are examples that really can challenge your appreciation for what they're doing. But for the most part, I think it's just a bad system. It's not bad people. And the bad system is, again, outsider ideas. And anytime you have taxpayer funded aid, I think there's immediately a difficult conflict of interest that is really hard to overcome. Meaning our aid is part of our foreign policy. And it is very common for foreign policy aims to pollute what aid is doing. But even when aid ostensibly, at least in name, matches what a local community desires, it isn't successful when it comes to development. You can send food and feed people, and those people who ate got some food. But if you're thinking that what you're doing is helping that country become independent and prosper, you aren't, for a number of reasons. One, you get very perverse incentives at the government level, and we've seen this with a country that is highly dependent on aid celebrating and having a party when they find out that they are once again on the bottom of the UN's worst countries, because it means that their aid largesse will continue. So you have to think about what impact that has on their accountability to their people, because what they're paying attention to is not sort of a democratic mechanism of serving their people, but serving their foreign masters and making sure that they're well positioned to continue to get aid. You have incredible amounts of siphoning and corruption. In some cases, I mean, 30 to 50% is common, but there's cases of 100% of funding not getting to where it needed to go. And then, of course, you have just the disturbance of it not being the right economic solution in a particular environment that sets them up for success. I mean, and we see this with groups that come in and dump a bunch of free shoes and put the local cobblers out of business. And if it was an example of voluntary buyers and sellers, you'd say, okay, well, the people have consumer sovereignty and they're identifying this this better product, but that's not the case. It's and you can't depend on foreign benevolence and aid to be participating in your economy on a regular basis. And one of the most common things that happens is, even where they get some results, they all go away once the aid dries up. It doesn't build anything lasting. And so we're spending all this money, we're spending all this time, and even more than the money, because the money, isn't necessarily a large part of our national budget. But to me, the big problem is that we're preventing the processes and the paths that are going to work. And that's where we point to and tell stories about different think tanks around the world who have their own vision for change, and they do achieve that iterative change in institutions based on sort of community input. And then as a result, you see sustaining successes.
Moving on to institutions, could you describe what you call the failure of copycat institutions? And can you describe your preferred approach of elevating local leadership?
Right. Yeah. So I think I mentioned earlier some timeline of about 30 years in development practice. Since the Marshall Plan, development has had different sort of themes that it was pursuing, and I think correctly, the focus has been on institutions the last 3 decades, but incorrectly, it has assumed that institutions are these products that someone who's familiar and an expert on it can then go and set up an institution somewhere else. And there's a very helpful book on this by political scientists Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes, who say, in fact, that not only is our approach to spreading the institutions of liberal democracy after the fall of the Berlin Wall not succeeding, it's actually partly responsible for the sort of misplaced resentment of the idea of liberalism, because we have presented liberalism as this gift from foreigners who know better than you what your country needs. And in fact, what we're delivering doesn't work in context, because again, it violates the principle of human dignity that helps you appreciate the role that those who are going to be governed by the institutions need to play in forming those institutions optimally for that time and place. And so you get to this place that's, again, probably worse off than if we had done nothing, because we've now sullied the brand of liberal democracy. And you see this rise of authoritarian populism, and people are responding to that, again, as Krastev and Holmes argue, not because it's a particular ideology that appeals to them, simply because it's not liberalism. That's its main virtue. And so they say, look, what China and Russia are doing, they are different in their foreign interventionist model than we have been, because we were trying to make other people like us. That's not what Russia and China want. What they want is to make other people serve their interests exclusively, to increase their power, both economically and otherwise. And so they don't have a particular set of guiding principles. And so we've got to do a better job of minding our P's and Q's as outsiders and truly looking at what the local vision of change is prioritizing and what initiative it's taking, and then support that. So a key thing here I want to clarify is it's not that that the ideal path for every country is to just out of whole cloth do whatever it thinks is best. There are still some fundamental truths and principles to the nature of human dignity and its role in allowing, in a very practical sense, allowing each person the freedom to play a productive role in figuring out the economic path to success for that community. But I think I think what we need to do is find, if we as outsiders want to do something to help, we have to find those who, again, fit that criterion of being subject to the governance of the institutions they're trying to change, and then within the broad umbrella of strengthening the institutions of liberal democracy, however they see that optimally happening, we can support their vision for change. And we've just seen, so the new administrator of USAID, Samantha Power, gave a speech in November on the 60th anniversary of the creation of USAID, in which she said localization is our priority. And then in a follow-up, and she set a target of 25% of funds within 4 years should be going to local organizations, up from 6% today. But in December, one of the newest examples of their effort to do this was responding to the Biden administration's push to get to the root causes of the migration from Central America. And so they, out of an office that had $2.5 billion to spend, I know at least 140 million went to a private contractor, a private known contractor, who is also an outsider. And so they were tasked with finding local groups. That was part of the value proposition, is that they were going to do that. And they went to all these local groups, and they were on a tight timeline, and they had already decided exactly what they needed them to do, which was go survey people and find out why they're migrating. And many of the local groups said, no, we don't think that's worth doing. We kind of already know the answers. You know, it isn't what they think they need. Again, it's so obviously driven by the foreign policy interests of the US, which we have every right to have foreign policy interests. But let's not pretend that our aid is the right answer for another country, especially if we're trying, at least in gestures, to be paying attention to what local groups need. So instead of coming up with an agenda and then finding local groups and paying them to do what you want, localization needs to be listening first, learning what people are doing, and then to the extent that what they're doing is in line with strengthening the institutions of liberal democracy, support what they're doing and in their own capacity building, so that they're stronger as a participant in civil society going forward.
You also have a chapter on dignity and diffusion of knowledge. Could you talk about that relationship?
Yeah, so one of the ways that that we think about institutional change is informed by this idea of the innovation diffusion curve, where again, if you go back to Ridley and you think about, okay, there's lots of inventions that happen, but you know, we've all seen prototypes for things, and they end up, you know, not being the thing that ends up being ubiquitous in everyone's house, because it's an unrefined thing that has to go through a process. But when you look at the way things go from potential innovations to full embraced innovations in communities and in society, you have these early adopters, and then you have these late adopters, and then you have the, you know, different sections across the curve, and they all play a different role. And if you think about ideas in that same way, that ideas kind of go through a similar process in terms of the sort of proven utility and the ubiquity of people embracing them. There are different roles that people can play in supporting that change, and the key part about that, I think, is again recognizing that no one of us should be too arrogant about thinking that our particular articulation or sense of an idea is, you know, the alpha and omega of the correct expression of that idea, or how it could be useful. And so that again is a process of pluralism, where you are dependent in a positive way, in the sense that you want something to come out the other side that works. You are dependent on the voluntary participation of others in shaping that idea. And so when we think about trying to play our small part in making the world a better place, by supporting local organizations and prioritizing and placing a premium on those who develop their ideas in concert with their communities, we just think that that is a much smarter, more efficacious way to make success more likely, because ultimately you want enduring institutions that people can trust in and rely on. And again, that's a function of the people that are going to be governed by it. And that's a complex adaptive system that that is a process more than it is an engineered result.
So you've touched on different parts of this, but what are the book's ultimate recommendations for reforming development practice, supporting liberal democracy, and what defines what you call dignity first development?
Yes, so there are some very encouraging things happening in development. Localization, at least rhetorically, is going in the right direction. You'll also see related to that this idea of decolonizing aid, and so some of this pressure for outsiders to check their own arrogance is sort of a common thread. So I think that's healthy, but I think we can't lose sight of the virtues of liberal democracy being the governance we're aiming for, both because it is, as Cressif and Holmes say, proven to be the most supportive of human rights of any other system, but also because it on net works in terms of human flourishing. And so if we can combine our commitment to liberal democracy with our humility to not reshape other people's communities and societies in our own imagined superior fashion, but instead afford dignity to those in those societies who are working to achieve improved institutional change, we can do that. But we also need to be, Atlas Network is in the somewhat unique position of being both a grant seeker and a grant maker because we're not endowed. And so we play both of those roles, and we understand both sides of that relationship. And many who receive grants from donors, you get a sense of how to optimize that relationship, and for donors to kind of know what kind of accountability is most productive to bring, and then what is counterproductive, and then for the grantee to know that they should not rely on donors to sort of support some sort of static set of activities, but that they should be trying to build something on their own. So we talk in the book toward the end about the appreciation for what I would call a universal entrepreneur. Within entrepreneurship, there's debates about what counts as an entrepreneur. And I say, let's just start in development. Let's just think about any person who is making choices to improve their livelihood. That's some entrepreneurial activity. And so we talk about people in the informal market who, again, are kind of incredibly enterprising up against incredible odds. So when we think about making, having as our goal this sort of constant and continual entrepreneurial set of revolutions, then we need to start thinking about social change as entrepreneurship also, and affording a dignity as well as an accountability to people who engage in social change. Meaning, you need to do more than just care and express your concern, and you need to challenge yourself to actually achieve change that proves beneficial to people. And so there then does emerge from these different perspectives a set of practices for improving economic development practice. And there are some other encouraging trends that I'll point out that I don't that I quibble with, but I think are incredibly important. One is Matt Andrews out of Harvard. He is advancing this idea called PDIA, which I don't think he went through a branding department, but it's problem-driven iterative adaptation, which is, again, this sort of pluralistic entrepreneurial engagement with local people to discover their own paths to improvement. So that is gaining speed in development practice, which, if nothing else, it's extremely beneficial for being at odds with the historical traditional practice of parachuting in a very linear engineered solution. So you have that, and then you have growth diagnostics, which is much more flexible about what some of the institutional hangups might be. Again, at odds with our tradition of copycat institutions. And so among these different approaches, including our model at Atlas Network, I'm encouraged to see that there is lots of interests along the lines of stopping the mistakes of the past and getting curious about what might be.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. This has been fascinating, and I hope everyone checks out your book again, Developments with Dignity. It is available for pre-order at the time of this podcast recording, and will ship in February. Check it out and check out the other great things that Matt is doing with Atlas Network. Thank you so much for talking with me, Matt.
Thank you, Chelsea. My pleasure.